If you have a Bible and you like to follow along, please turn in it to Jeremiah chapter 33. This is where we're going to spend our time. Here on this second Sunday of Advent, thank you again for the common lectionary by which I'm able to keep track of all this stuff. This is from the lectionary, so I really appreciate that. I've been in it now for 73 weeks, so very thankful for that. That's a gift I have appreciated every week of my life since then. We come to a time which really is quite grim for Judah. Very grim, as a matter of fact. It's not a happy time for them. They are subject to being overrun by Babylon. The northern kingdom already has been overrun. Babylon's already been to the southern kingdom once and has exacted tribute, which one of the kings, Jehoiakim, decided not to pay after a certain point, so Babylon has come back now. The king that's in place, Zedekiah, has said, well, we're not paying you, and for reasons I'll get into in just a moment, Jerusalem is now under siege. The siege ramps are outside the walls, and they're just waiting for whatever deliverance or that Nebuchadnezzar's armies are going to pour into Jerusalem. So what I want to focus upon today as an Advent Sunday conversation is, what is God's role in all of this? You can't call this anything but a disaster for Jerusalem. So what is his role? Let's take a look at the text. I'll begin reading in chapter 33, verse 14. I, the Lord, affirm the time will come when I will surely fulfill my gracious promise concerning the nations of Israel and Judah. In those days and at that time, I'll raise up for them a righteous descendant of David. He will do what is right in the land. Under his rule, Judah will enjoy safety, and Jerusalem will live in security. At that time, Jerusalem will be called, the Lord has provided us with justice. For I, the Lord, promise, David will never lack a successor to occupy the throne over the nation of Israel, nor will the Levitical priests ever lack someone to stand before me and continually offer up the burnt offerings, the cereal sacrifices, and the other offerings and sacrifices. The Lord spoke further to Jeremiah. I, the Lord, make the following promise. I've made a covenant with the day and the night, and they will always come at their proper times. Only if you people could break that covenant, could my covenant with my servant David and my covenant with the Levites ever be broken. So David will by all means have a descendant to occupy his throne as king, and the Levites will by all means have priests who will serve before me. I will make the children who follow one another in the line of my servant David very numerous. I will also make the Levites who minister before me very numerous. I will make them as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands on the seashore. The Lord spoke further to Jeremiah. You have surely noticed what these people are saying to you, haven't you? They're saying the Lord has rejected the two families of Israel and Judah that he chose. So they have little regard for my people, that I will ever again allow them to be a nation. But I, the Lord, make the following promise. I have made a covenant concerning the day and the night. I established the fixed laws governing heaven and earth. Just as surely as I have done this, so I will surely never reject the descendants of Jacob, nor will I ever refuse to choose one of my servants David's descendants to rule over the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Indeed, I'll restore them and show mercy to all of them. So what we're reading today is a follow-up. The good thing to do in this particular text is to read the context, and it's quite a number of chapters in order for you to understand exactly what's going on. And I can only summarize it just a little bit without spending too much time on it. But there is some history here that's important. They're in the middle of a 90-day siege right now. Nebuchadnezzar has been parked outside the walls of Jerusalem for 90 days. This is his and his army's second trip. They've already deported some people once. The northern kingdom's been swept away. They've already got a regent king from Babylon who's picked of the Jews but is overseeing that part of the nation. That part of the nation is no longer in control of itself. Jerusalem and Judah still are. Now there are reasons for this. One is the northern kingdom is more easily conquered because of the terrain. If you look at a relief map of Jerusalem and Judah, it's nothing but a bunch of rocks and hills. I mean, it's very difficult. You can't use chariots, for instance, with an army. They just can't get through there. So it changes how you have to attack them. It's a more difficult attack to make. The king who is king right now is not the king. Zedekiah is not the king. He is the uncle of the former king who has been deported, who is going to spend 37 years of his life in prison in Babylon. Ezekiel, the prophet, is part of this first deportation. So there's a lot going on here. Zedekiah has been warned. As a matter of fact, the nation has been warned for 100 years that this was coming. 100 years. And they've been warned, predicated on certain things. Well, Zedekiah has received all the warnings from Jeremiah, his prophet, one of the prophets. There are many. What's his response to Jeremiah? He locks him up. Zedekiah just has him locked up. He doesn't like what Jeremiah is prophesying. The northern kingdom's fallen, the siege ramps are outside the city, and yet Zedekiah is in denial of this outcome that is obviously, to anybody, to any fool could see that they're here. It's not a matter of if they're going to breach the walls, it's just how much longer is it going to take. Somehow he thinks that Judah is going to be spared in this way. Now, I can understand that as a Jew, looking back at their history. God has done things like that through their history. He has done miraculous things. He did so with Hezekiah and the Assyrians, which is a real tie-in to what's going on here at this particular time. But why would Zedekiah be resistant? He's got to have some authority for that. It's not just his whim, because there are prophets, and the Jewish kings knew to listen to their prophets. Jeremiah gets thrown in a hole because they don't like his prophecies and locked up in the courtyard, and the other prophets are telling Zedekiah things he likes. So he listens to them. They're still the prophets. Come bring the prophets in and let me hear the good news about how we're going to win. And Nebuchadnezzar's just going to turn around and go home. Let me hear that again today. Bring the prophets in. I want to listen to that. Man, I can't help but think, and I don't want to pick on this too much, I cannot help but think that in Western Christianity today, some of the largest congregations we have, why are they so large? Because they're being preached things that sound really nice and good. And so who doesn't want to come for that, right? Well, Zedekiah thinks that Nebuchadnezzar's done with him and is just going to go home. I guess he hadn't seen the siege ramps, the dust that's coming up outside the walls while all these armies work day and night to build these siege ramps to break the walls. This is exactly the cycle that you see in the Jewish history. God blesses them, they grow, they prosper, they become apostate over time, they start worshiping idols, they do all the things that God tells them not to do, and then God warns them for a long time, and then he brings destruction. The city, the walls, the temple, and all within the walls of Jerusalem are going to be burned, torn to the ground and burned. Everything that'll burn will be set fire to. Everything else will be torn down. All the loot will be hauled off. It's just going to happen. And that's exactly what did happen to them. It's exactly what happened. The kick in the pants for this whole thing is it didn't have to. Zedekiah was warned, and he was told, if you will just go out and surrender to Nebuchadnezzar, he will not do any of these things. But if you don't, you're going to be put to the sword. And that's the end of it. That's the prophecy that Zedekiah doesn't like. So Zedekiah thinks, I know what I'll do. I'll align myself with the Egyptians. Well, that lasted just a very short time when the Egyptians were completely defeated at Carchemish. Just wiped them out. Nebuchadnezzar had no problem dealing with them, and now he's got the siege ramps built on the walls of Jerusalem. And if you go into extra biblical archaeological history, the Babylonian Chronicles chronicle all of this in great detail, right down to the rations that the Babylonian soldiers were given to eat each day as they were laying siege to Jerusalem. In 587, all of Jerusalem was torn to rubble. Everything that could be lit afire was burned. People, thousands of them were killed. People were hauled away. Babylonians came in. It's the culmination of a decades-long situation between Judah and Israel and Babylon. King Jehoiakim, 37 years in prison. Another 30 years are going to go by, over 30 years, before finally Cyrus the Persian, the Medes and the Persian, come and liberate Jerusalem and conquer the Babylonians and set them free to go back and rebuild. That's a long history. Everything that God said is going to happen, happens. And it's the trajectory of over 100 years. It goes all the way back to Hezekiah, 700s BC. The Assyrians are camped outside Judah, but Hezekiah is a righteous king. He has reestablished the worship of God. He's reestablished the reading of the law. He's got all the scribes working again at what they're supposed to be doing. And God blesses him by sending the Assyrians away. But see, Hezekiah, this is a huge lesson, I think, for anybody, even today. Hezekiah comes to a place in his life where his prophet Isaiah comes to him and says, "King, you're going to die." And Hezekiah goes, "What?" Kind of like what I would say if somebody came to me and told me that. What? I don't really want to do that. And Hezekiah, I mean, he's just like anybody else, but the difference is Hezekiah has this totally childlike faith before God. Remember, he spread the letter that he got from the king of Assyria out in front of God. That's such a childlike thing to do. He goes to God and he says, "God, look at what I've done. I've been such a good boy. I don't want to die." God says, "You know what, Hezekiah, you have been a good boy, so I'm going to give you 15 years, but in that 15 years, I'm going to give you a lesson that you and everybody else will learn for all eternity. Better sometimes you should die. Better you should die." Why? Manasseh's born in that 15-year period. What did Manasseh do? He came behind Hezekiah and tore everything down Hezekiah had done. Even went further. Rebuilt the idol in the valley of Hinnom to Molech so that they could have their children burned alive and sacrificed to Molech. Instituted all of that. Restored all the high places, all the pagan worship. You see, the reason, and there was a pause in that with Josiah for just a little while, but Josiah couldn't undo all the damage, and the next kings that followed up to the time where we are now in history, they've been apostate for a long time. They're apostate because they're basically polytheists at heart. That's just the way it is. They're Semites. They've been for thousands of years. Well, up to this point, about 1,500 years, they've been raised up as polytheists. And so the worship of God is really hard for them. This worship of Yahweh is really hard because it's so austere. One God. No images allowed anywhere. It's kind of like what G.K. Chesterton says about Christianity. He says Christianity hasn't been tried and found wanting. It's just been found hard and not tried. And I think he's right about that. God tells the Jews, if you read the whole prophecy throughout many of the chapters previous to what we read today, "I'm going to fill your houses with your dead bodies." That's what he tells them. Now, I want us to stop for a minute and imagine that for our time. Just for a moment. It's hard because everything's just clicking along for us. Even though things are uncertain right now, they're still kind of clicking along. But imagine a prophecy like that coming to us today. You know, this Advent for me, I can't speak for anybody else in this room, but I can speak for myself, is just surreal for me. I mean, it looks to me as I look out, watch news items, it looks to me like everybody's just straining to celebrate this season for the most part. I mean, can you imagine being in Seattle? Who would put Christmas decorations on the front of their store in Seattle? It's a time of celebration in a time of gross uncertainty for all of us. It is for me. But it's not like it was for the Jews in Jeremiah's time. Our uncertainty is more so an uncertainty of inconvenience. For them, it was life and death. So let's place ourselves for just a moment in the hearing of Jeremiah. If there were a Jeremiah in our time, would we recognize Jeremiah, him or her? Would we? a Jeremiah type person, a prophet who's going to tell us. So let's think it through. Babylon, whatever that would be for us, is going to come and it's going to do its worst. And we may be swept up in the worst. I think all of us in this room would probably cling tenaciously to God's promises. That's what God is doing here through Jeremiah in this text. He's making another promise. But how would we hear those promises? I mean, those promises are promises for the future. How would I hear that? Looking at my life, your life, our children's life. How would we hear the promise? Would we say, gosh, knowing that God's going to do something in the far off future doesn't really make me feel a lot better today? How would Romans 8:28 sound to us if Babylon were parked at the door? God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. We take that as a promise, and I believe it. How would we hear that if we were in the times of Jeremiah, contemporarily? We've got these Old Testament prophecies and all these narratives, and they're not there as a dry history lesson. This text we've read today, it can be done, you can read it that way. I mean, I got to confess, the last 4 years, 5 years of my life, and now even today, a lot of this stuff for me becomes history, ancient Near Eastern history, and it sort of robs the impact from me as I read it. I'm not caught up in the visceral understanding of what it is to be in Jeremiah's shoes or in the Jews' shoes while they watch the dust from the siege ramps come up around Jerusalem. But I don't think God at all intends these kinds of texts to just be a dispassionate history lesson. There's something for us in this text. So what is God? There's the question, what is God saying through this text to us today? I'm going to say he's saying what he's always said. Never changed. He says, look to me, all the ends of the earth, and be saved. I am God, there is no other. It's the same thing he's saying. Here at Advent, nothing has changed in that message to this very second as we sit here today. Look to me, all the ends of the earth, and be saved. I'm God, there is no other. The Advent is the guarantee that what God says is going to happen is going to happen. I look at that and I say, thank you, God, that I can have the confidence in these uncertain times wherein I see history as his story, which it is. And we can have confidence in that. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, speak with me after the service, I'll stay as long as it takes.